All right, so this is going to be episode 4 of team profiles for set G. This video is going to be about slacking. All right, so this is going to be the last episode team profiles for set G. Uh, so I can prepare for uh, team profiles for set I. All right, so slacking. If you're familiar with competitive Pokemon, needs no introduction, right? Was introduced in Generation 3, and Generation 3 was basically the flagship game for competitive Pokemon, right? It was the first game they introduced doubles, uh, first game they introduced uh, abilities, and where they really expanded on held items, right? Which basically make up the core of the competitive strategy for uh, VGC, right? Official Pokemon circuits, right? So, you know, Generation 3 was a very influential generation on competitive Pokemon, right? Made a couple videos exploring some Generation 3 Pokemon, particularly uh, Regice, and I've made a few remarks about um, kind of how Generation 3 has impacted a lot of important Pokemon in VGC, right? And probably the most important aspect of uh, VGC, Generation 3's influence on Generation 3, and Generation 3's influence on VGC was the release of Slaking, right? Um, so Slaking is a Pokemon that's been heavily mystified in competitive Pokemon, and so this video is gonna help alleviate a lot of that confusion. All right, so if you're familiar with Slacking's stat line, you know that Slacking is no slouch, right? And that's being very generous, right? Slacking has uh Slacking is essentially a box legendary, right? Like that's the best way to really sum it up. Its stat total is basically that of a box legendary, right? Your like Kyogre, Groudons, Koraidon, Miraidons, right? Your Mewtwo's, whatever. Um, it's also a normal type Pokemon, right? So you take something like Slacking, right? Slacking, again, right, having a base stat total of a box legendary and also being a normal Pokemon, right? It was basically Terrapagos, right? Before Terrapagos was Terrapagos, right? Because Terrapagos also essentially a box legendary in terms of its stat line and its competitive viability, and it also is a normal type Pokemon, right? So if you're familiar with legendaries, you know that Terrapagos is the only normal type legendary Pokemon, if I'm not mistaken, and um, wasn't like some feat of brilliance for them to design Terrapagos because they basically already had a sampled Pokemon to base Terrapagos off of, which was Slaking, right? Terrapagos is basically um, special Slaking. It's the best way to put it, right? Has a very high HP when it terrestrializes, very high attacking stat and its special attack. Then across the board, its stats are just very evenly distributed, and yeah, right. So Slaking, as opposed to Terrapagos, right? With Slacking was basically designed to be the premier doubles Pokemon, right? Slaking is right. It's a normal type Pokemon, right? And so as a result, it has a very wide move pool, right? But besides that, right, it was also released in Generation 3, right, where there was no special physical split, right? So all normal moves, right, were considered physical, right? And so, wide move pool aside, its main attacking typing was also its main typing, right? So it got stab moves into its best stat, right? So not only that, right, its only weakness, fighting, right, due to no physical special split, was also only a um was also only physical moves, right? And if you're familiar with Slacking stats, you know that Slacking has a very high defense stat. I think it's 100 if I'm not mistaken, and but its special defense is very low, right? It's like 65, right? And so it may seem right that you know um Slacking, right, whatever, right, it has a very high attacking stat, whatever, but you know given its big drawback, which is its ability truant, right, which if you're not familiar with, what it does is that every other turn Slacking uh cannot take an action, right? If you select an action, uh Slacking cannot take that action, right? So except for like switching out, right? um so it basically like uh balances out its tremendous stat, right? And so um all that aside, right, Slacking's only weakness, right, was fighting moves, right? And probably the most devastating fighting Pokemon in Generation 3 was Machamp, right? But it's probably its most devastating attack was probably Cross Chop, right? And Slacking, right, has a much higher speed stat than Machamp, right? So even up against a Machamp, right, Slacking would move first, right, without stat modifiers, and would be able to deliver an attack into the Machamp slot before the Machamp can even do anything. So, you know, even stacking two fighting Pokemon, right, you would still not be able to, devastate a Slacking, right? So, Slacking effectively had no weaknesses in Generation 3, right? Generation 3, was old school Pokemon, right? And so the majority of people that were playing Pokemon in earnest, didn't really have the capacity to, you know, um, basically report their findings in a meaningful way, right? So it was not like Slacking was not just a very good Pokemon. It's just that like basically the people who are playing Pokemon, um, weren't in a position to give Slacking the the attention it deserves, basically, right? So, fast forward and as a result, we've seen a lot of neglect from Slacking, right? So I'm gonna try to give an explanation as to how Slacking works and why, try to back up, my um thesis, if you will, that Slaking is a basically the premier VGC Pokemon, right? So let's get right into it. So the Slaking is Ghost Terror Slaking with Life Orb and has 252 attack, 252 HP, 4 defense, and it's adamant nature, right? And it has Shadow Claw, Throat Chop, Double Edge, and Slack Off, right? So basically, what you're trying to do with the Slaking, right, is you're basically trying to just chunk a slot, basically, right? So anything that so Slaking, normal only is resisted by rock and steel, and um is immune, and ghost Pokemon are immune to normal, right? So um outside of those type-ins, right, you don't really get to see a lot of Pokemon with very high defensive stats and stuff like that. So generally, if you're going to press a move into a slot, right, it's gonna do like 60% minimum, right? If it's a stab move, right, and you effectively have two stab moves with this Slaking in Double Edge and um, the Terra Ghost Shadow Claw, right? So basically, what you're trying to do with the Slaking is you're basically just trying to lead it, right, and then just pick off a slot, basically, right? Your opponent's going to be forced to either focus the Slaking or, um, or have to take some sort of defensive option into the Slaking, right? And so it makes your opponent's plays very telegraphed, basically. So not only that, since Slaking has such a uh, beautiful stat line, right? It is going to be able to shrug off basically whatever uh, play your opponent um, tries to do, right? So that's effectively what you're trying to do, right? So um, you know, format, threats aside, that's essentially your game plan, right? So after you've taken that slot out, right, or chunk the slot or whatever, you basically can now basically now you have like an edge, right? In theory, you'd have an edge, right? So you know, obviously your Slaking can attack again, but now you've basically set up your board so that you can just make a more telegraph play, right? So that you can extend your lead, right? So the slot that's going to be beside the Slaking is just all creamy, right? And so this is a Steel Terra all creamy with leftovers, right? And it has 252 defense, 252 HP, 4 special attack, bold nature. It has Sweet Veil, right? Which prevents you from falling asleep, and your prevents you and your allies from falling asleep, right? And it has Dazzling Gleam, Recover, Decorate, and Calm Mind, right? So Slacking's biggest weakness, right, is not being able to attack, right? Obviously, made it very obvious with his ability, right? And so the main way that your opponent's going to stop you from attacking, besides using something like Fake Out, is by putting you to sleep with a spore or a sleep powder or something like that, right? And so um, basically you lead with Alchemy so that your opponent can't just lead with like an Amoonguss or a Smeargle or something like that and just press spore into your Slaking, right? And so that basically just takes away all the means of devastating your board, basically, right? So after your slacking has basically um chunked the slot, right? You're gonna have to switch it out, basically, right? Unless like your board state is just so good that you don't even have to switch out your slacking. You're gonna have to switch it out, right? And so what the Alchemy does basically is gives you a board, right, where you can switch out your slacking, right? It's probably gonna bring in something that's gonna threaten it very significantly, right? And then you can do something like press a decorate into that slot, basically, right? So usually I cover like the third slot, but I'm gonna go to the restricted for this, for to kind of explain this, right? And it's that so the restricted for this team is Rayquaza, right? The normal Terra Rayquaza with clear amulet that has 252 attack, 252 speed, adamant nature. It has extreme speed, protect, swords dance, dragon ascent, right? So again, right, Slacking's main weakness is fighting moves, right? So given your opponent having something like an Iron Hands or like an Urshifu, for example, you can bring in the Rayquaza, press decorate into the slot, and then you can eat a physical fighting move or whatever, and now you have a threat on the board that is +2 with a priority move, right? And so that's effectively like the line that you're trying to take, right? Your opponent is not going to really be able to do much into this, considering unless they have something with some very powerful special move, right? Like an eruption or a water spout or something like that. Um, they're not going to really be able to do much after the slacking has chunked the slot, right? So yeah, you get the decorate off, you get the calm mind off or something like that, and you just extended your lead, basically, right? So yeah, the third slot that you're going to be using is Araquanid. So this is a citrus berry bug terror Araquanid as water bubble, and it's 252 HP, 132 attack, 124 special defense. As liquidation, use life, wide guard, and sticky web, right? So this is an alternative to lead with the slacking, right? For the aforementioned uh, powerful special moves that you'd want to avoid, like eruption, water spout. And so basically what this does is allows you uh, to actually lead this slacking still and prevent your opponent from just picking it off with an eruption or something like that, right? So again, right, those moves function off of HP, right? And so slacking is going to do at least 40% into that slot, even if it's a Torkoal, right? And so um, after the Pokemon has been chunked, right, the move turns off, right? And then you can play your game, right? And you have your sticky webs, and you have the boosted liquidation from the water bubble, right? And so now Pokemon that might have had an edge against slacking because they're faster are -1 speed, right? And they can't press spread moves, right? So that's the core of the team basically. And the beauty of the Alcremie and the Araquanid is that they both resist fighting moves, right? Alcremie being a fairy type and Araquanid being a bug type, right? And they both have heavy investments in their defense and special defense respectively. Right? So you've covered all your bases in terms of, you know, shrugging off fighting moves, and you basically set up a good board state so that your slacking can thrive, right? So yeah, that's the core of the team, right? And so the pivot slots, we have Delphox, Fire Tail Delphox with Focus Sash, special attack, 252 special attack, 252 speed, human nature with Blaze, as Mystical Fire, Psychic Terrain, and Magic Room. Right, so if you watch my Rhyperior video, covered Delphox and how you can set up very good board state with Magic Room, right? So basically, this would be an alternative setup for something that's trying to lead with a focus sash. You can press Magic Room. The Delphox is faster than the Slaking, right? And then Slaking can press Double Edge into that slot, and the Pokemon's dead, right? So the other pivot slot is Superior. So Stellar Terra Superior with Ability Shields, and it has 252 speed, 124 HP, 132 special attack. Contrary, it has Gastro Acid, Helping Hand, Leaf Storm, Terra Blast, right? So there's another slot for um, an alternative lead that you can set up with Slacking, right? So Slacking has been the subject of a lot of cheese teams, right? Where you effectively turn off Slacking's ability, then you basically try to carry with the Slacking, right? And so this is basically like the support. That's basically the support that Slacking has gotten over the generations, right? The ability to turn off its ability, right? In Generation 3, you would have had to do it through Skill Swap. And then Generation 4, we got Gastro Acid. Then Generation 8, we got Neutralizing Gas, right? So, yeah, same thing, right? If you're playing Slacking, you're going to want a way to turn off its ability, right? And so for this team, in the pivot slot, we got in a way to turn off its ability, right? And it's through the Superior Gastro Acid, right? So, um, this Superior is very good into teams that may want to, Terra Ghost, for example, um, to counter the Slacking or Terra Steel or something like that. In that you have the Stellar Terra Blast, right? And with the contrary, you get a +1 bonus, right? Instead of a -1 bonus. So you got another sweeping option in the Superior, right? So yeah. Uh, so yeah, Slacking has just been a very misunderstood Pokemon over the generations. Um, you know, VGC in comparison to something like TCG is much less of an explored game, and that's because VGC is more of an expensive game, right? And it's a game that has less volatility, right? And so as a result, it's a game that requires a lot of um, effort, right, and reps to basically um, get better at it, as opposed to something like TCG, right, where there's less of a barrier of entry, right? And so, it's no surprise that Slacking hasn't really been the subject of uh, VGC players' attention, right? So, yeah, it's very much like kind of understood that if you're going to play Slacking, you're probably just going to play it with some sort of ability turning off cheese or something like that. And that's just very far from kind of how Slacking is designed, right? Again, right, in Generation 3, right, Slacking, the only way to turn off Slacking's ability was through Skill Swap, right? And I don't even think Skill Swap worked on Truant in Gen 3, if I'm not mistaken. But, um, yeah. And so, Pokemon clearly did not want Slacking to just be some, um, it didn't just want it to be some sort of, Pokemon like like huge power Azumarill or Light Ball Pikachu or something like that, right? Where they're just kind of just spoof archetypes, that you wouldn't really play, right? Pokemon clearly went out of its way to design Slacking to be very devastating, if it gets a good board state. So obviously, you wouldn't have to have such a high maintenance board where you need to have its ability turned off, or something like that in order for it to succeed, right? Slaking's a very low maintenance Pokemon, right? Again, right? It has 160 base attack, and its stab moves all have like 100 base power or more, right? And so it doesn't need all this fluff, right, to succeed, right? If you understand it, right? So it just seems it's actually really ridiculous. I'm just laughing because it's just so ridiculous to think that something with 160 base attack would need any more support besides, just having a high attack investment, right? So yeah, um, it's definitely something where you would definitely lean more into it. Going into an event would definitely be in your top five, if not your top three, of archetypes to consider, right? Just due to, again, right? It's just complete devastating uh stat line, right? So yeah, um uh so thank you, right, for listening, right? So this was the last episode for Team Pro Buster Set G. So I hope you enjoyed uh my coverage of this format. Um and yeah, Set I um is coming up in about 2 weeks, right? And compared to like the last format where we had two restricteds, right? Um, we've gotten, we actually gotten a lot of restricteds come out, Terrapagos, Kratom, Rhydon, right? And so it's going to be very interesting to kind of see this format unfold, right? And before we had like Dynamaxes, right? So with Terra types is going to be interesting as well, right? So looking forward to it, right? Still got a lot of set G to play. The global challenge just finished up, um, and don't believe there's any more regionals for set G. Actually, I think there might be one or two more, um, but yeah, people are definitely preparing a lot for set I, considering it's going to be for Worlds, right? And so yeah, it's gonna be very interesting to kind of see that unfold and get a lot of insight on kind of how people are approaching uh, set G. I mean set I, right? Now that we've had two set Gs, right? Um, yeah. Um, so yeah, definitely gonna be interesting to see that, and so hope you can take a lot from my team profiles for set G. Kind of uh, help use it to help you, prepare for, you know, team building for set I. So yeah, thanks for listening, and see you in the next video.